installment of our webinar series that we call Science at the Edge. This is hosted by the Institute for Science and Policy. This series is really about exploring new and emerging ideas in the science and technology realm as it affects society. I'm Kristen Uhlenbrock. I am your host for this series, and I work at the Institute for Science and Policy. Today, we are going to be talking about cultivated meat, also known as cell-cultured meat, or you may have heard the term and phrase lab-grown meat in the media. What these are actual food products. Think seafood, pork, beef, but they are cultivated using animal cells directly. So I'm guessing many of you who've joined us today are like me. You've either come across this and you're quite curious about what it is. Maybe you've seen some headlines recently talking about some of these emerging markets or some of the policy debates that are happening, and you're really interested in learning more. So if so, you're in the right place, and thank you for joining us. We have a couple great, thoughtful experts here today to unpack a lot of the questions, some of the science, some of that policy, and some of the perceptions around this issue. Just a quick housekeeping item for our audience. We'd love to see any questions you have in that chat feature, and we'll do our best to incorporate them into this discussion as we go about. I send my apologies in advance if we do not get a chance to answer all of your questions that you have. But I have joining us today Dr. Jennifer Martin and Dr. Matt Hotze. Jennifer is a faculty member at Colorado State University and in the Animal Sciences Department, and she also teaches with the Colorado School of Public Health. Her research interests lie in a systems-based approach to meat safety and quality. Hi, Jennifer. Welcome. Thanks for being here today. And we also have Matt. Matt is the Director of Science and Technology for the nonprofit Good Food Institute, which is a think tank working on bettering our global food systems. He leads a team that builds out the ever-expanding map that is alternative protein research, and has a really big global perspective on this. So thank you for being here today, Matt. Let me start. Let me bring you all into this conversation. I'd love both of you. Just give me, give our audience and me like a 1-minute response, a little bit more about who you are, what motivates you in some of the work that we do. Jennifer, do you want to start with a little intro?
Happy to. Thanks for that introduction, and really happy to be here today. Like mentioned, I am an associate faculty member here at Colorado State University. I'm originally from Texas, grew up in agriculture, and during my career in high school, kind of the learning experience there, I recognized that there was a science that underpinned all of the things I was seeing around me. And so chose to pursue a degree in animal science so that I could really understand the science that goes into producing animals for meat consumption and then the meat itself. And my work here at CSU really focuses on strategies to enhance the quality and safety of meat that consumers see at grocery stores, restaurants, or wherever they purchase their products. So happy to be here.
Thanks. Matt, what about you?
First of all, thank you for having me, Kristen, and it's wonderful to join you here today, Jennifer. I'm based in Texas, based in Houston, Texas. I'm a father of 3, background more in environmental engineering than food science, but I switched over to starting to work for the Good Food Institute a couple of years ago. And one of the reasons for that is because the food system really underlies a lot of the environmental problems that we're seeing coming out today. And for the future of my kids, for the future of the planet, I'm excited about working on a food system that works for everybody, that is more economically diverse and can solve some of our current environmental problems, including, climate and water use and land use and biodiversity.
Great. I think we'll talk about some of those. But Matt, let me start with you, and Jennifer, you're welcome to chime on here. Give our audience a little bit of this background. Like, what are we actually talking about when we say cultivated meat? What is this? What's this process?
Yeah, so I think the best place for the audience to go in terms of maybe lived experience is to think about beer breweries. And I know there are a lot of beer breweries in Colorado. So if you go into a beer brewery, there really are 3 main products that they put into their reactors. Basically, they put in yeast, they put in grains, and they put in hops. And if you compare that with cultivated meat, you're really putting in three main products. You're putting in animal cells, you're putting in macronutrients like amino acids, and you're putting in micronutrients. These are the same nutrients that any animal needs to be healthy. And then at some point, you're basically growing these cells in a reactor. When you have a certain mass that you've reached inside of the reactor, so enough cells to then harvest those cells, you can take them out of the reactor and either blend them with a product, or you can actually put them on a scaffold and have them become a full-fledged like chicken breast or steak. That takes a little bit longer, but that's the ultimate aim of these companies, is to either produce something like a more of a minced product coming out of the reactor, which is the animal cells, which are identical to meat cells that come from an animal, or these fully cut products like steaks, or as you've seen on the image, the cover image of this webinar, these are basically tuna steaks that they're serving up from this company.
And so we're producing all sort of potential meat products, right? It could be seafood-based cells. It could be animals, different types of animal proteins. Is that correct?
Yes, there are about 150 companies globally that are researching and developing in this area, and they're covering all manner of different products across the board, from seafood to terrestrial animals.
Jennifer, can you add on a little bit too and give us some of this like R&D background and history of where we've got to what the process looks like today?
Yeah, I think, from a scientific perspective, the innovation that we've seen in this space is really fascinating as a scientist, seeing how we've taken technologies that have existed for a while. The ability to culture cells is something that's not new. But the development of that technology into spaces where we can produce food is what's really occurred in a concerted and intentional sense over the past couple of decades. And I think what folks who are asking questions, the example of a brewery, I love that. I'm going to use that in my class as a way to explain this to my students. But in the science space, we often relate this to tissue cultures and some of those same processes in which many folks may have recalled several years ago where scientists grew a human ear using human cells, and they were able to allow that tissue to form into what was then used to replace the missing ear on a patient. So the core technology itself has been around for some time. And I think what we've really seen is the investment and the recognition that, hey, this technology may be used or might be able to be used in a space to generate foods in a new way. And that research and development that's occurred, I think, what we've seen over the past several years, if not a bit longer, is where we're at today is so much farther than where we were a year ago, and certainly where we were 5 or 10 years ago. And it just really speaks to the investment in a technology that's not new, but directing that technology towards a new outlet, and that outlet being the food system.
Yeah,
I'll add there, Jennifer, like for perspective, right? Is it a decade ago, there was a scientist named Mark Post. Mm-hmm. He made one burger patty, and it cost $330,000 to make one burger patty. And currently today, right, we have two companies that are approved to sell cultivated meat in the United States. Admittedly, those are chicken products, not beef products, but at the same time, they've reached the level where they can actually put this on the table at some reasonable cost.
It's remarkable. It really is.
Yeah.
From an agricultural perspective, there are questions, and I respect and understand those questions about what this means from a food industry perspective. But as a scientific exercise, that innovation is remarkable to see.
Happening very quickly, right? This is what I'm hearing come from you all. It was this uptake, right? Which is sometimes really, it takes a little bit of that retrospective look to see something coming out of both the research experimental stage into the market phase and the scaling phase. So I feel like this is what's happening, right? You all have talked about 5, 10, 1-year timelines. This feels quite quick, and in a really sort of intense way right now. So I want to stick with this. Why are we seeing this surge potentially happening, right? Is it the markets that are in place, the regulatory framework, all of the above? Talk to me a little bit about why we're seeing these more headlines, why this is starting to come now into potential markets.
So I would just say, I think one of the reasons is it's an era of food innovation across the board, right? When you think about in similar spaces, when we see in the plant-based meat proteins, there's been just as much, I won't say just as much, there's been also a lot of innovation and improvements in that space. And so consumers are, it's an interesting dynamic where we see consumers who are interested in new products, new things that are available for them to purchase, or the ability to choose between traditional and something that's new. And that's really been a defining characteristic of the past decade, is the innovation that's occurred in the food space. The other thing that I think that's really speaking to this particular topic is the globalization, right? So recognizing that the technologies aren't just happening, or the development of technologies aren't just happening within the US. This is something that there's a lot of interest and investment in globally. And so learning from what's happening in other countries, using what they're learning to apply within the US, that's something also that I think has defined the past decade or so, is innovation in food, but also the learning space from partners and collaborators in a global state versus when you think about traditional food production, traditional crop production, if you will, it really is pretty regional, or it really is pretty local. It's not as if my family who's farming in Texas, we're not asking folks in Eastern Europe, hey, what's working for you there to change how we grow crops in Central Texas? So I think that exchange of information really has allowed things to move so much faster. And then that culture that it just kind of transcends everything of innovation in food.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say that, thinking about the global drivers for this, I mean, the global meat market, depending on the estimates that you look at, is around $1 trillion. And it's estimated also, depending on the estimate you look at, it's that the global demand for meat will go up 50% by 2050. So if you're looking at a market of $500 billion, right, you start to see why there's been, at least in the US, on the US side, there's been a lot of VC type investment in new meat products, because people see this as a space that needs to be filled, and the current technologies that we have are more than likely incapable of filling those spaces. And certainly, even if we tried, we would face biodiversity losses. We would face, increasing climate impacts from these industries. So we need to start considering other and diverse sources of meat, basically.
Yeah, and I would just add on to that. I think that challenge of feeding the growing population has been an underpinning priority, right? For both the traditional meat industry as well as this cultivated meat industry, and recognizing that, we often hear feed the nine. How are we going to produce enough food to feed the population that will be here in 2030, 2050, and beyond? To Matt's point, if we use only the current infrastructure that we have and the current processes we have, we know that it won't be enough. And we also know that one of the things that developing countries tend to want to consume as they have a population that is affluent enough to purchase it is meat. And so as the protein demand goes up, what can we do with the traditional protein production streams to meet that demand? And that's where the gap was acknowledged. And so the traditional meat processors and livestock producers, they're working to address that gap, but it has some real challenges. We don't have enough physical space. We don't have enough labor capacity to meet that demand if we were to only rely on traditional processes. And so that innovation opportunity that existed, and here's where we need to be, here's where we have the capacity to go, how are we going to fill this? And it's amazing when that necessity comes up, right? Like how people step up with really good ideas, and then you have an influx of capital investments in those spaces, and then lots of other things, right, that have to fall into place. But it really has been a cool time to be in the food sector, to see that the impetus for this challenge was the recognition that we're going to have a population that demands animal proteins or meat proteins, protein in general, because they're affluent enough, and we can't meet their demand. So what do we do?
Matt, will you continue on with this too? I think we need to spend a little bit more time with these great ideas that you all are putting out here, which is this idea of this massive global food system that has this growing demand from population projections that we already need. We have food insecurity already that exists in the world, and that is going to be exacerbated and expanded as a growing population surges, what we're expecting. But the global food system has these bigger impacts, right? It has this climate lens into it, this biodiversity lens and loss because of the restrictions on and the impacts on use of land that we've been talking about. Talk to me, what are some of the hopes? You started to do that. Just take me another level deeper into this. What are some of these climate benefits that we're talking about that this could have? Because there's part of it, which I think I heard you, Jennifer, articulate, which is we have a food system, right? And this is additive into that food system. But I also know that there is the interest in alleviating some additional impacts that our current food system produces on the environment. Could you all take this one step further for me? Matt, why don't you
Yeah,
start?
I mean, yeah, of course. So again, depending on the estimates you look at, these are global estimates, but greenhouse gas emissions as a total of the percentage across the globe from animal agricultures could be around 13, 14%. And if you look at the sectors that are the biggest emitters, you're seeing that of the things that have been invested in terms of decarbonization, the food technology, as far as we've already come, and we've already been talking about how far we've come from an R&D perspective, has a relatively low investment dollar amount compared to something like transportation or fossil fuels, which has had billions and hundreds of billions of dollars globally put into it, sometimes per year, for R&D solutions. So we're looking at, from the Good Food Institute standpoint, is saying, how do we increase the investment in this area, not only in cultivated meat, but we look at some other technologies as well to try to mitigate this climate impact from food? Because even if you stopped all fossil fuel emissions today and you just held the food emissions constant, we wouldn't hit our climate targets for the Paris Agreement.
Yeah, and I'll just speak from like a livestock production perspective. I think that point is exactly right. There's not been as much investment in that space of how to improve or reduce the environmental impact, improve the sustainability metrics of livestock production. And I think that's one of the things that there's more recently a concerted effort here at CSU. We have a group called Ag Next that does research in that space in the beef cattle industry. There are groups across campus in the research space that are trying to figure out how can we acknowledge that the environmental impact of livestock production is not zero and does need to be acknowledged and decreased. And in order to do that, there has to be an investment of research. But I think one of the challenges that we see is research that is translatable. And that really becomes one of the most interesting pieces in the livestock space. When you think at the number of livestock producers, so beef cattle producers in the US number over 800,000 independent beef cattle producers. How can we take science that works in a laboratory here in Colorado State University and translate that so that it's effective for all of the different producers who are producing animals that are going into the meat supply chain? So it's going to take some time for us to actually see some reductions that are meaningful. And so I think it's the recognition that this investment in technologies that are mindful of this from the get-go, right, from the starting point, and then trying to unweave some of the things that are happening in livestock production and inform at the same time those producers so that as we're learning from a research perspective, that research on how they can become more sustainable or reduce their environmental impact is translated and implementable to them. It's not going to happen overnight, and having both of these things happen in concert is really our only hope at finding a way to sustainably produce food with the metrics that we have in place, but also just for the future of our globe, right, and our future population, regardless of the metrics that we're trying to meet.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'd add on to that one of the potential benefits of cultivated meat is a dramatic reduction in the amount of land. So if you're looking at beef and cattle, some estimates are as high as 95% reduction in the amount of land that you need to produce that beef. What that does is opens up opportunities to be a simultaneous solution to regenerative agriculture, because regenerative agriculture by nature requires more land. And I think a lot of I've never been a rancher, but I do believe that a lot of ranchers want to keep their land in great shape. They want to make sure that they pass their land down to the next generation in perhaps even in better shape than they have than maybe we have in previous generations. And those kinds of things can happen with regenerative agriculture, but that also requires more land. So how do we provide our protein, maybe get some of our beef production over into a less land intensive technology, and then allow for those who are practicing these great practices of regenerative agriculture to have the space to be able to do that sustainably?
Yeah, I think that's an important. Sorry, we could keep talking about this.
Yeah, sorry, we keep talking. Yeah.
We'll just keep going.
Please go, Jen. I actually want you to explore a little bit more because we have such a strong ranching producing community here in Colorado in the West. So I wanted Jennifer to just add on to that a little bit more too.
Yeah, I think that's where the really interesting intersection gets, right? So how do we respect and recognize the history, the livelihood, and when we think about sustainability, recognizing that sustainability isn't just greenhouse gases and emissions, there's societal and cultural sustainability that plays a role as well. And so this is often the space where I find myself as a person who studies in the traditional meat science space, interacts regularly with livestock producers. When they hear the topic of cultivated meat, the question is, what does that mean for my livelihood? And what does that mean for my generational way of life? And it's a weird space, right? Where there is a recognition of the things that we're doing right now may not always work and we need to improve. But does that mean we need to replace? And I think where we find ourselves having the conversation of there's a balance, and we can't feed the growing population without every single person who is producing food playing a role, or every single entity that is producing food playing a role. There are going to be folks who still want to go to the farmer's market and see the farmer who raises the pig that they purchase pork from. There's still a need for that. And I think that's one of the intersecting cultural pieces of this technology, is balancing that respect, the tradition, with the acknowledgement of we're going to have to do something different in order for us to move forward as a society. And also embrace the opportunity that exists for innovation and technology such as this one. I think one of the interesting pieces, and this is kind of reflects on my own upbringing, what we see right now too is the impacts of climate change are impacting livestock producers today. And so when we think about most recently, for example, there were really large wildfires in the panhandle of Texas that were devastating to cattle producers in the panhandle of Texas. That's becoming more and more common. We've seen wildfires, forest fires on the western slope of Colorado. We see producers who are impacted by drought. They can no longer raise livestock. So we've seen a turnover in folks who have been generational livestock producers who say, there's not enough water for me to do this. And so how to balance not only this recognition that climate change is going to be a thing in our future that we need to address, but it's impacting our food system right now. And it's impacting the ways in which we produce meat right now. And that balance and that sort of dichotomy of recognizing that if we wait until climate change has had its impact, we won't have a food system. We can't wait until that's happened. We have to innovate while we're trying to balance and address and maybe even in some spaces correct what we're doing in the traditional livestock sense, so that those industries are sustainable in the future. They can recognize and use regenerative agricultural technologies so that they can have land that is available for their livestock herds for years to come. If we wait, it won't happen.
Yeah.
Let me ask you all one more kind of science-based question, then I want to pivot our conversation into actually talk about these products a little bit more, but this is related. We had a couple folks asking about mutations within the different types of cultures, or the level of diversity that's needed for any sort of source cell. One of you wants to speak to that about the actual sourcing of the cells?
I'll let you take that one, Matt.
Oh, yeah, good. That's a pretty technical question, but basically what you need are to select for cells that will survive in these reactors. So this is not every cell that you take in a sample. And so the companies are really interested in cell lines that have an affinity for being in cultured meat reactors. But what we've seen from studies of this is that any sort of genetic material or anything, I mean, they're not being altered, they're just being selected. But any sort of genetic material, according to the FAO, according to some of the international bodies, is not being transferred in to your body. So you're when you eat those, any sort of, it just becomes like a normal cell, right? There's no genetic transfer into that. And also when you cook it, there's nothing about that would actually like cause you any harm.
I think like at its root, right? It's not very different from the meat that we buy at the grocery store today. The way in which, I mean, the same processes are happening inside of an animal. This is just happening
Mm-hmm.
inside of a bioreactor. And so and that's again, from a scientific perspective, that's one of the really cool parts, is that we can replicate what the body does outside of the body. But those cells have the exact same properties that you would see within the animal itself. They're
Exactly.
taken from the animal itself. So they're using animal cells to actually find ways to grow the tissue outside of the animal. And there are, as Matt mentioned, like tremendous amounts of regulations, best practices on how to make sure that cells that are being used in those spaces are pure, right? So we don't have contaminated cell cultures that are going into that. There are strategies that have been used in human medicine for decades that have informed what they're doing in this space and really help. But once the product is formed and once it's cooked, then it's very similar and very difficult to distinguish at the cellular level from the cell that you would get from the steak you can buy at your local King Soopers or Safeway or Walmart or Costco.
Yeah, to build on what Jennifer said there, I think, people, the two companies that have approval for sale in the US, they went through an approval process with both the FDA on one end of the, so as they were cultivating the cells, the FDA was approving that process in terms of purity, things like that Jennifer's mentioning. And then once they started actually making the meat part of it, the USDA started taking over that process. And so both the FDA and USDA has certified both of these producers but they needed both of those steps. So there's been a lot of interaction with regulators in order to get this to the restaurant level, at least.
What's the labeling like?
So labels right now have to be approved by USDA, and that's the same requirement for if here in our facility on campus we're making bacon, we have to also get that label approved by USDA. And so the processes which apply for cell cultured meats are the same processes once it becomes a meat protein as we have for traditional meat proteins. So the labeling requirements, the safety requirements. And to Matt's point, that was really a landmark shift and a landmark change that's happened in this space, is finding out how we can regulate cell cultivated meats so that consumers have confidence in the meat I'm buying, whether it's from a traditional pathway, from a rancher to farmer's market, grocery store, wherever they find it, or it's coming from a cell cultivated process. The meat has the same standards. And so labels today have to be approved by USDA. USDA has a really rigorous set of requirements. So if they call it beef, what does that actually mean? That's defined by USDA. If it's bacon, that's defined by USDA. And so I think that comfort that consumers can have is that level, the playing field is equal at that point in time because the requirements from a regulatory perspective are the same.
So we're talking about, these products actually coming into restaurants, right? They exist here in the US through a couple companies. Matt, you brought up, you said it's a lot of venture capital, a lot of VCs, right, have been kind of seeing this as an opportunity. We're seeing restaurants form. So what are the products that exist currently in restaurants? And the price of this has to be right now, right, quite high still. And have we reached some sort of tipping point, right, where people see this as an investment now, and this price is tipping, and we're starting to come down? Maybe Matt, do you want to start with this, and Jennifer, please add on.
Yeah, I think one thing that we're seeing is increase, at least on the U.S. side, is increasing interest from an investment standpoint from the U.S. government. So the initial kickoff point was really from the private sector, but now there's a reason that the government is saying, okay, well, this is a food security issue, right? If the demand for protein or meat is going to go up 50% by 2050, we need to start thinking about putting the infrastructure in the ground to make this happen. And unfortunately, like it or not, venture capitalists are not really interested in spending a lot of money on infrastructure. They'd much rather get a quicker return on their money. And so they were in the space to see what would happen. And, inevitably, startups come and go. 90% of startups overall fail. So that's just the risk that venture capitalists take. And so now is kind of the moment in time in terms of bringing down the price, scaling this up. It's the moment in time for public entities such as the U.S. government or philanthropists to step in and start to invest in some of these larger, more capital-intensive projects that will be required to scale this up to the level where you would actually see this in the grocery store.
So when we get to seeing it in a grocery store, right, we're not there yet. I just wanted to, an audience member wanted to make sure, is there a label to be expected that it would say this on it, that it is cultivated, it is cell cultured, or we don't know this yet because it's not in that marketplace?
We don't know yet what that will be because there isn't a retail approved label for cell cultured meats today. Those conversations are still going. Right now, cell cultured products, so USDA has regulatory authority for meat and poultry products. FDA has regulatory authority for plant-based meats, things of that nature. So determining who will establish their retail labeling requirements is going to be a really important piece of this conversation. As you would expect, there are lots of stakeholders who are involved in that. The traditional meat processors, the cell-cultivated producers, those who are somewhere in the middle, retailers, restaurants, all of those folks are interested and curious, but that decision hasn't yet been articulated by the federal government.
Have either of you had some of these products?
I have, yeah. I had some at a conference it seems like a couple of years ago. I think it was actually just last year, but it seems like a long time ago.
What did you have, and what did it taste like?
I had chicken, and I have to frame my experience with it from a scientific perspective, right? So from a scientific perspective, we do lots of sensory research. So I'm trained on how to pick apart meat products. I'm probably the worst person to go to dinner with because I'm really picky about the things that I can sense versus maybe things that I don't. So I noticed some quality attributes that I didn't prefer with the product, but I don't know if those same things would be experienced by the average person who's not a sensory scientist who eats meat samples all the time from a scientific perspective. And I think that's one thing that from a scientist perspective, we're really interested in. How can we help understand consumer preferences around these products? And so working with the producers who are making them and asking the questions, can a consumer tell the difference in a chicken breast from a chicken and a chicken breast that is from a cell-cultivated process? We don't know right now. And I think that's one of the spaces where my team and the group that I work with here at CSU, we would love to be able to participate in those sorts of opportunities whenever products are available to do so.
Matt, I'm guessing you've tried some products.
I actually have not, but I have several colleagues that have tried it. So based on their experience, they say, well, chicken turns out tastes like chicken. They did. I mean, if there were other issues, I didn't hear that it's articulated. I will say though, this is curious to me because I haven't heard of anybody tasting this product, but there is a company in Israel that just got approval from the Israeli government to sell cultivated beef, and they were the first ones in the world. It's called Aleph Farms. So if people are interested, they can look that up. It's Aleph Farms.
Is the maintenance and storage and shipping, like the containers, how we need to, keep things refrigerated or keep it packaged a certain way, do those same properties still apply to cultivated and cell cultured products? Like we should be treating them, and companies and restaurants, et cetera, are treating them like we would other types of animal-based products.
Yeah, I mean, they essentially have the same functional properties as meat. And so it is a perishable item that would need to be refrigerated. It would need to be cooked, right? Similarly to how we cook meats currently. I think packaging, I think there's just as much opportunity for innovation in packaging to help reduce the impact of plastics and so on and so forth. But today, it would be packaged in much the same way at the retail level that we would see traditional meat. You may not see as much packaging at the storefront itself, right? Because the stores aren't producing the products, right? So it may look more like something that you would see at a Walmart, for example, where there's not a butcher case where a person can come up and say, I want you to take that whole ribeye and cut it into a smaller ribeye. That's to be determined, but that would be my guess, is that it's likely to have less of that storefront interface and maybe more like the packages you would see at the grocery store that are already in a package.
One thing I'll add about the cold chain is has not been studied, but people, because of the high purity that is needed to grow the cells for cell cultivated meat, there is some thought that the potential for bacterial contamination and growth might actually be lower for cell cultivated products, and that actually might result in a shelf life that is slightly elongated compared. But there's been no studies on it because it hasn't. There's just not enough product for that yet. But it is interesting to think that because these processes require so much sterility that you might not be introducing as many contaminants as you would in a slaughterhouse, for example.
Yeah, I think that's again another study that there's a lot of folks in the research community who are excited about the opportunity to answer these questions, because there's certainly a lot of curiosity. There's a lot of R&D interest as well. And so I'm hearing you talk about that, Matt. I'm like, wow, that's a study we would love to do here, because that would help answer lots of questions for sure.
Well, and I would love that, right? Because if we can reduce the cold chain requirements, that's not even part of really this greenhouse gas discussion as much. I'm not sure where people are drawing their boxes around these
Right.
systems, but the cold chain is probably not part of that, and that is a huge greenhouse gas producer.
Absolutely. And then you think about food waste, right? When we know like any perishable food has an infinite
Mhm.
amount, or not an infinite, a finite amount of days where it's able. And we see in the meat space, lots of meat products are discounted at retail levels because they're off colored, or they're totally fine from a safety perspective, but they may just not be as visually attractive because of the cold chain deviations and bacterial growth. That's not harmful bacteria, but bacteria that may change the color or the smell. And so the amount of food that we throw away because of cold chain challenges or shelf life challenges, that's also, I think, an added benefit that could be on the table for something like this, if they're able to document that there is a shelf life advantage with these products.
Um, when you say cold chain management, I feel like this is a little bit of an insidery term to
Yeah.
our
Sorry.
field. You guys
No
want to
worries.
explain? Yeah.
Yeah, so it would just mean that so any perishable meat product must maintain a cold temperature. One, there's a regulatory requirement for that from a safety perspective, but it's perishable. And so if it gets too warm, then those products, the shelf life or the amount of time that that product is going to be attractive or desirable or maintain the quality properties that consumers want, it's going to go down. And so we generally refer to the cold chain as the requirement that the product from the point of production to the point of consumption is kept cold, right? We don't leave fresh meat products in the back of your car and expect them to come back the next day and they're fine. We know that's not the case. And so that cold chain is not only from the point of production when it's going from the manufacturing facility to the grocery store, but going from the grocery store to the consumer's home and in their refrigerator, every piece of that's considered the cold chain. And what we know in the traditional meat science space is it's one of the weakest links, right? Even if producers and processors of these products, they do a great job of making sure when it leaves our facility, it's going on a truck, the truck is cold, we have temperature recorders, we know it's cold, but then you have a person who goes to the grocery store, puts it in their shopping cart first, spends 30 minutes in the grocery store, drives an hour to their home, and then they have a refrigerator that is too warm. That's also part of the cold chain. And that also it reduces the amount of time that product is going to be of good quality for a person to consume. And so collectively, we call the whole thing cold chain, but there are lots of different players within the cold chain.
Great. Okay. We've got about 15 minutes left. So I want to shift a little bit of this conversation into, we talked about some of those regulatory frameworks that exist both with USDA and FDA. But we are seeing quite a bit of interest in the policy world quite large. We have seen a number of states potentially introducing bans or restrictions on selling of these products. I'm wondering if you all could unpack a little bit of what we've been seeing happening across various states. And I'd also be curious how this is being received internationally. But let's start here in the US. I don't know, Jennifer, you want to start commenting on this and Matt too, but why are we seeing this sort of rush all of a sudden and policy moving at state levels?
Yeah, I think it's a question I've gotten quite a bit recently, and I think one of the reasons is it's a response in fear of not really knowing what the future looks like in this landscape, and the fear that's being felt is what are the impacts to the traditional agricultural community. And so, in many of the states where these regulations are being considered, agriculture has a significant role in the state's GDP. So in the state's economy, it's a large contributor. And so whenever there's concern that there are technologies or strategies or whatever it may be, they're going to risk that without understanding the full impact. One of the reactions is, well, let's just stop that thing that's going to risk something that's so valuable to our state. And so I think, in my opinion, most of the policies that I've seen being proposed are in that space of this is threatening to an existing piece of our state's economy or piece of our state's history. We're concerned about what its impact will be, and we need time to figure out what that impact will be. And so to give ourselves more time, we're going to ban these sorts of products from entering into our grocery stores or our restaurants. So I think it's frankly a bit preemptive because we're not close to those products coming into the grocery store. You know, it's not going to happen tomorrow. And it's also reactive to a reality that this is going to happen. And so if we have policies that are prohibiting it from happening, it's not helping those livestock producers actually acknowledge this reality and find strategies to sustain their businesses within this space of the future. And so I think what we're going to see is it's actually harmful to traditional agriculture in the states where they've passed it because it's creating a false reality that's not going to be sustainable.
Yeah, Jennifer, I couldn't agree more. And I think not only are these kind of anti-competitive, right? These companies need to survive, stand on their own. They need to produce products that people will eventually buy. So there's that spirit that we're working against, but also I would say thinking about other opportunities that come for farmers, for example, from these technologies being developed. So I mentioned earlier cultivated meats needing macronutrients and micronutrients, and so a lot of right now there's a huge amount of soy being produced in this country, and one of the primary routes for soy is to feed it to animals. However, there are active research projects on taking the amino acids from soy and using that to supplement cultivated meat reactors in order to grow these cells more efficiently. So that gives those farmers and that economy another route by which to sell their product. And I think we'll see this across the board with alternative proteins is like it won't be a centralization of technologies, but rather a diversification of technologies that gives farmers and ranchers are some of the most creative people that I've met in this job so far. And to give them more options, to put more options on the table for them is, I think, and is an exciting opportunity that we may be missing out on if we're just closing the door on certain technological options.
What about internationally, Matt? Like what sort of conversations, receptivity, different regulatory environments or policy environments are you seeing exist or discussions happening?
Well, I think internationally, like you see action from companies that have more food security risks first. So a place like Singapore imports a lot of food. So they're interested in new technologies. They're really like the vanguard of this. They're looking at something that everyone else is going to face, but they're facing it first. Israel being another example, right? They're not the most food secure country. So they're the leading edge of something that's going to happen to basically the whole global economy. They're just seeing it first. So those places have been more aggressive about supporting this research and development, and also supporting the companies in that regulatory environment. So it's not only about the regulators coming in and deciding that it is safe. That is extremely important, but it's also a matter of like being patient with these companies and working with them because it's a brand new technology and it's not something that can just fit into the same box that they've used for other regulations in the past. I happen to know also that this Israeli company that I mentioned has applied to sell their beef in Switzerland and also in the United Kingdom, and those regulators are working actively with that company to try to get those products approved.
It's interesting, like this conversation around how countries that are food insecure may not have the capacity currently to produce proteins at the level they need them. We're also seeing domestically the same sort of conversation in the pet food space, which is a complete shift in the other direction, but I think it's an interesting parallel because anytime we're seeing competition for human grade animal proteins, whether it's in the global market space and countries that can't produce their own are relying to import that products from other countries which are great at producing traditional meat proteins. In the pet food industry, we're seeing a lot of interest as well in cell-cultivated meats for the same reasons, and that they're competing with human grade meat products, and humans, that market is tending to be more profitable for most traditional meat protein producers. And so pet food manufacturers are looking at how can I meet the need for buffalo that I have, recognizing we have a really finite number of those animals in the US. Can we use cell-cultivated meats to meet the pet owner's demand for protein-based pet foods? So it's been something within the past couple of years that as the pet food sector has recognized they're competing against humans for food for animals, is this an opportunity for them to lean into this technology now, especially that the landscape in a regulatory sense is becoming more clear?
Right.
Yeah, I
Y'all
mean,
are
if
doing
you,
this.
if you
Go ahead, please, Matt. Yep.
Can I riff off that just really quickly? I know this isn't about cultivated meat, but there's some exciting companies out there that are looking at biomass fermentation,
Mhm.
and not only for human consumption because it's actually a pretty complete protein with a lot of amino acids, but also looking at that for pet food applications as well. So that could relieve. So we're talking. I think the big picture here is we're looking at, okay, what does protein demand look like globally and how are we going to be able to satisfy that? And so we at the Good Food Institute, we talk about all these different pieces because they all need to kind of come into play to relieve this future hole that we have in our meat and protein supply.
I actually think that's a great, Matt. Like, what is giving you all excitement, and hope, and like what's on the future for this for you? Like, if you're both deeply steeped in this space, you're talking a lot about it, but like there's so much fascinating here. My curiosity has been sparked even more from talking with you all. But what do you see as that cutting edge? What do you, if you look out, what gets you excited?
Well, I put on my researcher hat, and I think there are still so many questions that have to be answered. So, from our research community, I think the excitement about it's really rare in the food industry that there is such a new technology where we can ask these questions for the first time and generate data that really is shaping the landscape of the future of the food industry and the food system as a large entity. And so, I'm really excited about you know 5 years from now, when we have enough companies that are scalable, where we can actually do research at the consumer level, we can do research on safety and shelf life. I'm excited about the opportunity to answer some of these long-standing questions that we just don't have the answer to today. So the research side of my brain gets really excited about that. I think from the other part of my brain that focuses on my person and sort of my upbringing in agriculture and my respect for the traditional agricultural communities and those who produce livestock is the opportunity to realize a new future for our globe, and the recognition that we've kind of been in this space for a long time, that it's either or, right? It's got to be us or them. And I think I'm excited about the opportunity to recognize that if we all are in the space of producing protein, it's going to take all of us to do that. And helping our industries navigate that recognition of it doesn't have to be competitive. We can acknowledge the strengths that each sector and each type of industry bring to the table and then move forward with that in the future. It's going to be a really big challenge, but it's something that I have a personal connection to, and I'm excited about that challenge.
Yeah, I think a couple things I'm excited about. I think a lot about these technologies is not well, I'll use the opposite. I'll say these things are going to be regional, right? So because it's food, you need to be close to the when you're producing new food technology, you still need to be close to the feedstocks for that food. So, for example, I mentioned the soy protein hydrosylates earlier, right? Those, if you had a factory that was dependent upon those, like a cultivated meat facility, you would want to be placed close to those. And so those wouldn't necessarily be technologies that are concentrated in the cities, but they would be regionally distributed across the country. It makes me think of you know, wind turbines, for example. Those are all across Texas. And some towns in Texas, like Sweetwater, Texas, I just drove through on my way to Colorado a couple of weeks ago. They have a giant fan blade with the town name painted on it outside of Sweetwater, Texas. It's wonderful. And clearly that town is benefiting from this new renewable energy technology. So a future that I see is how do these technologies distribute across the country so that we see an economic benefit that is more equitable in the food system and not just concentrated in population centers, for example. And then the second thing, because Jennifer had two, so I'm going to use two, but the second thing I'm excited about is the research side. So building on what Jennifer said, I think with the increasing investment from governments and from philanthropists, you're going to see a different rate of learning. So a lot of times when you're looking at R&D inside of a venture capitalist driven company, they're not sharing a lot of that information, right? So the things that they learned that were successful, the things that they failed at, don't tend to be published as much as in academia. So if you're getting your money from the government, they're going to ask you to publish those papers. And so learning rates for these technologies start to increase really fast when you see that type of situation. So I'm excited about just populating the food science sphere and also just biotechnology in general, like populating that sphere with folks that have a higher level of knowledge and that are not repeating mistakes of the past and are learning from other people's successes.
That's great. I typically like to end on a positive, which is what you all just did, but I'm actually going to have one more for you, which is giving you the opportunity to rethink or reframe something that is, we're going to have social acceptance challenges, which we do with so many things, right? So is there something in that social acceptance realm or within the misconception realm, that you find yourself wanting to talk about or address a challenge that surfaces, a piece of misinformation, a misconception? Do you have one of those that you want to share that you'd like to talk about?
For me, I think, thinking about my primary audience being those who are in the traditional livestock meat space, is that this is a replacement for their way of life. And that's, I think, a misconception. I don't think that's a reality that lives in the future. And I don't foresee it being a reality that lives in the future. And that's often what I hear most whenever I talk about this topic is these companies are trying to take my livelihood. These companies are trying to take away my way of living or those sorts of things. And so I think that misconception, that social piece, is one that I would like to address and recognize it goes back to we're all trying to feed people and allowing folks wherever they sit along the spectrum of feeding people the opportunity to do so. And so it doesn't have to be either or. And that's a really big misconception I hear often.
Yeah, I would say that, surveys show that when people understand cultivated meat, a majority of people actually want to try it. They're interested in saying, well, this is a new technology. This is a technology that will allow me to have a lower impact with my food consumption. I'm very interested in trying it, but I realize that not everyone is that way. So I think it's important that we continue to have open and honest conversations about what the technology is, and that we rely on facts to drive us forward in terms of, like Jennifer said, we're all in this together. Like the protein supply is the protein supply, and we're all drawing from that supply. So we better be working together across the board, rural, urban, coast to coast, about solving this problem from a food security standpoint.
Beautiful, thank you. I'll make the little commentary. We had an original graphic that we were using for this, and Matt generously got us the use of a different graphic and photo of actual piece of tuna that is, and I see these images now, Matt, and I'm like, oh, that looks delicious, and my
it's a
mouth
real, yeah,
and
it's a
that's
real product. Yeah.
Yeah. So to me, I'm also in that like ready to try something realm as well too. Thank you both. I learned a ton, so I'm guessing my audience did as well too. Thank you to the audience for joining us today. There were a ton of awesome questions. I think we got through a lot of them in the conversation today. We'll send this video back to everyone with some additional reading materials. But definitely thank you, Jennifer. Thank you, Matt, for joining us and for sharing your expertise today. It's been an absolute pleasure to talk with you.
Thanks so much.
Great. Thank you, everyone. Take care. Stay tuned. We'll send you more information about future episodes as well. Have a good rest of your afternoon.